I have today as my guest Ferris Abraham. I don't know that anybody knows more about what is going on the ground in the Middle East from a Christian perspective than Ferris Abraham. We need peacemakers like Ferris Abraham. We need people who can speak intelligently about what's going on in the Middle East. And Ferris Abraham could do that better than anyone I know. He was born in the West Bank. And so I am delighted to have Ferris on the Hank Unplugged podcast. Ferris, I want you to address the issue of Islamic terrorism. You know, I wrote a book, Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. Islam has advanced through terror. In 635, just 3 years after Muhammad died, Damascus, the city where Paul was heading when he experienced his dramatic conversion, fell to invading Muslims. 2 years later, Antioch, this was where the disciples were first called Christians. And then shortly after that, the Patriarch of Jerusalem had to hand over the city to the conquering Umar. So what was once Christian became Muslim. And it was always the mission of Muhammad to advance by sword. It was the mission of Christ to advance by word. You were talking about the advancement of the kingdom of Christ by word, but terrorism, Islam is almost synonymous with jihadism, and it's a completely different paradigm.
Well, we have to differentiate, Hank, between two things: Islam and Muslims. There are so many different peace-loving Muslims that I know and that we minister to and we work with, neighbors, friends, people that have no intention of terrorizing anybody, of harming anybody. And but when we approach this dilemma in the 21st century, and I know it's debatable, and I know it can be very divisive topic, but I always approach it from a gospel perspective, and I look at the life of Paul. Paul, in today's term, who was Saul, would be labeled a terrorist because he was sent to Damascus to get Christians, to handcuff them and bring them back to Jerusalem so they can be tried and probably killed. But Jesus showed up that day on the road to Damascus. He changed Paul's perspective and he transformed his heart, and Paul became one of the greatest apostles that planted churches across the world. And you and I discussed the Macedonian call before, and you beautifully put it down in paper where you talked about seminal moments, and you say the Macedonian moment was one of those moments that forever changed the history, right? And this is when Paul, who was a terrorist, was transformed. He saw a vision. He saw a vision of a man calling him to come and preach the gospel to Macedonia. And probably in Macedonia, there were not a lot of believers. Probably, there weren't any believers. And when Paul set sail, he went to Philippi. He met Lydia, who became the first Christian in the continent of Europe, and the first church was planted in Europe. So we should never, ever, ever, ever underestimate what God can do through a terrorist. And if we really overlook this, I mean, if we can say, these terrorists, they deserve death. Well, if we killed Paul, we wouldn't have the Apostle Paul. The dynamic of the whole Christian history would be different. Where we are today would be different. I don't know what it would be. God would have raised someone else. But because God himself saved the terrorist through a miraculous way. And every salvation, by the way, and I want to underscore this, every salvation, it doesn't matter whether people get saved through radio, through a podcast, or listening to a sermon in church, or reading a book, and most of the time in the Muslim world, is through a dream and a vision. But when people come to faith in Jesus, their life is transformed. God can take the hardest of heart, a heart of a cold stone, bloodthirsty murderer, and can transform that heart to soft, loving, gentle, kind, people with integrity. This is what the power of God, when it transforms someone, this is what happens. Perhaps there's another Paul that lives on this earth. I'm going to chase that guy. I'm going to give him the gospel. And when they get the gospel, their life can be transformed. And because Europe was transformed and we got the gospel to the United States as a result of that, maybe there is an Arabic-speaking soul to be saved, to plant churches across the region and to get the message of the gospel to spread like wildfire. So this is the paradigm where I come from. I can debate this, Hank, all the day long, using political names and saying, this is in this category, this fits in that category. But the gospel, God looks at it differently. He's looking for the Poles in the Middle East. I want to find the Poles.